Welcome to Dual Citizens. My name is David Old.
And I'm Stephen McAlpine.
And I'm Carl Trueman.
That's right. We have got the Reverend Dr. Carl Trueman with us today. So exciting, Steve.
Yeah, you might have read plenty of things he's written, and a prolific writer, but here we have him on camera.
On camera, person. And you get to join in. So here we are. Today we're chatting to Carl Trueman. Steve, I just think just before we get into that, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that we need to get our wardrobe coordinated a little bit better.
It's a bit embarrassing. If we were turning up at a wedding as women, one of us would be going home to change. Right?
It would be you. I like to think it would be you. And our guest didn't read the memo, but only read half of it and has managed to shave his head. So we kind of almost got it there.
I looked in the mirror after preaching a couple of Sundays ago and I realized it was over. And I took out the head shaver that I bought about a year ago and I just went straight over the top. So there's no going back.
It's that liberating moment, isn't it, where you just embrace the reality of what God is doing. Carl, it is just so good to have you with us. You are professor at, I want to get this right, professor at Grove City College in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies, the author of many books, too many to mention, but probably most clear in people's minds at the moment, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which came out a few years ago, including the smaller condensed version, Strange New World, and more recently, Crisis of Confidence, Reclaiming the Historic Faith in a Culture Consumed with Individualism and Identity. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about those two books, first of all? What's going on in them?
Sure. Well, by background, of course, I'm actually a Reformation guy, 16th, 17th century history of Protestant thought. That's where I did my training. But about a decade ago, I was not only teaching at a seminary, I was also pastoring a local church. And I became intrigued at the way that young people, and by young people, I really mean sort of people who I suppose now would be under 40, but then perhaps would have been under 30, thought so dramatically differently about things like sexuality and gender. And I'm not talking about crazy bad people. I'm talking about ordinary young Christian people who simply didn't find the Bible speaking as obviously about some things as I did myself. And I wanted to find out what's going on in our culture that is leading to this dramatic shift, this dramatic change in the way of thinking about sexual morality, a way of thinking about identity. And that was the origin of the Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self book. And to summarize my argument just very briefly there is, my argument is essentially what's happened in the last 400 or 500 years is a new way of imagining ourselves within the world, which places great priority upon our inner feelings and less emphasis upon external connections, such that we now in a situation where, hey, if somebody feels they're a woman or thinks they're a woman, even the external reality of their own body does not have any authority. So that was the origin of the two books on the self. Crisis of Confidence was actually a mildly revised reissue of a book I wrote over a decade ago, The Creedal Imperative. I'm a passionate believer that churches are best served by having good creeds and historic confessions to define who they are and how they think. And after finishing the two books on the self, I was left thinking, it's not enough to just analyze the problem. As Christians, we're called to live here and now, in this time, in this place where God has set us. We have to start thinking about how to respond. And it struck me that one of the building blocks of response is really to go back to the things that have helped the church during times of turmoil and crisis in times past. And among those, I would say the creeds of the early church, and then the great Protestant confessions of the 16th and 17th century. These serve the church, often in very hostile environments, as a way of guiding her thinking during times when, people were wondering, well, what is Christianity? How does the church connect to the wider world? So the Crisis of Confidence is really an attempt to encourage Protestants in particular, to recover the historic creeds and also the historic confessions of the church.
Yeah, and that's, I guess in one sense, at first blush, you could see that as a switch from books about culture to books about, what's going on with creeds and confessions. But as you read it, you get you're bouncing off those, the distrust of language in our cultural moment, the individualism, and how the creeds sort of speak into that in a situation where we're not even creedal in our songs anymore in church at the moment. It feels like, I grew up as the classic fundamentalist that you speak about, yet the songs we sang at least kept us within the guardrails, I think.
Yes, I think one of the things, but it doesn't so much apply to the Protestant confessions of the 16th and 17th century, but one of the things we are acutely aware of relative to the early church creeds is that they weren't simply a declaration of the church. They were often intimately connected to baptismal liturgies and confessions. In fact, one of the things that drives the formulation of early church creeds is baptismal confession. And also they were very connected to the liturgy of the church, and the creeds would even be sung. So I think what you're pointing to there is very, very important. And again, one of the things I would want to argue about creeds and confessions, again, particularly with the creeds, is we shouldn't just think of them as, if you like, legal documents that define who we are. They're also to be living documents that are be part and parcel of worship. And the real audience, certainly for the creedal imperative, and by and large, I think, for crisis of confidence, was good evangelical, or you use the term fundamentalist, good fundamentalist people who love the Bible, they love the Lord Jesus. I understand why they're suspicious of creeds and confessions, because they don't want anything supplanting or replacing or even standing alongside with equal authority to the Bible. But the case I want to make in the book is the Bible itself actually presses us to have these kind of things in our churches to provide, I think you used that wonderful analogy, the sort of the guardrails, to keep the church on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, and even as with church planting in the last 20 years, it seems like many church plants that have gone out to be independent are suddenly rediscovering, we've got to put something in this that gives us some framework, even if they're sort of a little bit, pick and mix in some respects. But I've seen church plants that are leaning into, well, we're going to have these songs that are a bit more up-tempo, but we have to have creedal statements and things like that. And it feels like we got a bit wrong 20 years ago with some of the church plants, but that people are now starting to go, we got to get this right.
Every era makes its errors, except for me, of course.
Yeah, of course.
That's why you're writing the books. That's why you're writing the books, Carl.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to talk a little bit later about why many evangelicals are tempted, and some are even convert to Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. I think part of the conversions, part of the reason for some of the conversions I've witnessed is a desire to find historical roots and a desire to find some sort of historical tradition, because it stands to reason that the church is not reinvented every Sunday. Intelligent Christians know that. And I think a self-conscious acknowledgement of that by the church through the use of historic creeds, historic confessions, and even historic hymnody. Not that you just have to sing historic hymns, but an acknowledgement in our documents and in our liturgy that we do stand on the shoulders of giants is very important.
And it does require that humility, doesn't it, to say that, again, and this is this central thesis that you've helped us to see, this analysis, there's a truth that lies outside of me. And I'm going to make myself subject to it because of what it is and what it represents. And so that's a very tangible way of going, actually, I'm not the center of the universe. Yeah, let's talk about the Olympics with Carl.
Yeah,
really
the
keen to do that. Yeah.
Well, they were finished. Some people felt they were finished from the opening ceremony. A great juxtaposition. My daughter mentioned that the start of the Olympics in Tokyo, when no one was there, Imagine was used, and then it was used again this one. But crazy. But the Paris Last Supper scene, if we're allowed to call it that, how do ideas from your books, lean into how that arrived and why that's been so contentious, that whole Last Supper scene?
I think in some ways it's I only touch on this really in the big book, but I think underlying one of the impulses that when you start to think that it's our inner feelings that are the most important, that tends to make us iconoclastic. Over the last 400 or 500 years, really, we've been tilted towards thinking that external authorities make us inauthentic. They're problematic. And to be truly authentic, one must break through those imposed limits. And in the West, of course, that has often taken the form of kind of sacrilege, because where have the limits by and large come from in the West? They've come from a social order grounded in a broadly Christian sacred order. So in order to express our freedom, we have to transgress what are often seen or would have seen by previous generations as sacred boundaries. So there's a sense in which the mocking of the Last Supper through the use of drag queens or the sort of the queering of the Last Supper, it makes perfect sense with the cultural logic that by and large applies in the West, and that is Christianity is oppressive, and if we're to be free and authentic, we need to break free from that. And the best and easiest way to break free from that is to make Christianity ridiculous, to take its idioms and to make them nonsensical.
Can I just butt in, Carl? Because something just occurs to me, and I would love to get your thoughts on it. As they did that, I think you're right, they deliberately tried to ridicule it. After the pushback, the director goes, "We had no intention to offend." Now, can I just ask you, what's your assessment of that? Is he just lying, or actually, in his own mind, is that actually perfectly valid? Like, I just like if anybody could get inside that brain, maybe you could do. Like, what's your thought there? Sorry to interrupt, but I'm just going. What's going on there?
Well, my immediate instinct is to say, if anybody believed that, they should email me, because I could do them a fantastic deal on the Brooklyn Bridge right now. I mean, obviously, we can't read another man's mind.
No.
I would say we have two options here. Either he intended to cause offense, or he's a complete moron. And it doesn't seem to me that we have a sort of a third option here. I guess I'd like to think that he was just foolish. That seems to be a less morally reprehensible interpretation. And it's quite possible. You know, was he so benighted that he didn't think it would be offensive? Maybe. More likely, I think, that it was done deliberately. Well, maybe not. Maybe he thought that people don't care anymore. But it was certainly done as, I would say, a sacrilegious act.
Because he doesn't care anymore.
Thought people would be upset. I mean, it's hard to imagine the same guy, and then this has been said many times, it's hard to imagine the Paris Olympics opening with a mockery of the Quran.
And in France, of all places.
In France, of all places. It's hard. I mean, it's possible, but it's very hard to believe that. And if you're not going to mock the Quran, but you're going to mock Christianity, it looks to me as if it's kind of intentional at some level, and you're picking on a soft target.
Yeah, and part of that's obviously the totem of victim in our culture. So you have how you are Christianity, obviously, even though it's minority in the sense of it holds the power. So you can see the narrative. We can mock it because it's held power. We have minority groups that we shouldn't mock because of the totem of victimhood in one respect, which you speak about in some of your writings. But it seems to be it wouldn't matter how much of a minority a Christian group was, it's still historically held power.
Well, it still has cultural power, right? Otherwise, what's the point in trying to
Why would you mock something that no one...
Good.
And of course, don't forget that the European Parliament, there was great offence caused with the sort of the BDSM Jesus, the artwork that was put up at the European Parliament. You know, if this person had not noticed that controversy, I'd be very, very surprised. You know, that was like a dry run for the opening ceremony. So I'm disinclined to take him at face value.
All right, Carl, sorry to interrupt. So that's book one, analysing, well, not your first book, but the first one we're talking about, analysing how do we respond well to that kind of thing? What are the insights?
That's a good question, I think, because we've done a lot of analysis over the last 10 years, but it feels like how do we move forward as church is kind of the last chapter or the acknowledgements of lots of books on cultural engagement or a cultural critique. And it's saying, how does the church move forward well in those situations, both evangelistically and in identity?
Yeah, because I'm sure you're having the conversations that we're having here in Australia, which is, how do you respond to this? Well, it's about inclusion at the table. Can't we kind of lean into that kind of motif and do that? And others are going, no, it was just plain repulsive. And there's a whole swatch of people out there who instinctively, we discussed this last week on our episode, instinctively know that that's the case, but need to be shown why that's true. Why that's true, and see Jesus that way. So how does the thinking that you're doing about going back to creeds and what they represent, how does that help us then respond? Wow.
Yeah, well, I think it should help us remind us of what our primary purpose as a church is. When we look at something like the Paris Olympics opening ceremony, one of the things I would say is it's not just about inclusion. The church is there to vindicate the name of Christ in public. And Christ is being mocked at that point. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for the church to point that out and to object to that. If it's also an opportunity to speak about inclusion, then use it. I don't necessarily see those two things as being mutually exclusive. I think the second should temper how we address the first. Be careful that we go for the issues rather than personalities. So I would say that the desire to use it as an evangelistic opportunity should certainly temper how we respond to the blasphemy. It's one thing to strike out against blasphemy. It's another thing to call for the hanging of blasphemous, if I could put it that way. So we need to be careful that we don't allow our passions to run away from us. But to go back to the creeds and confessions thing, I think it's important to realize that there's a sense in which I don't expect the world around to do anything other than mock Christ at some level. The most important thing, and the thing over which as Christians we do have some control and some power, is that the church herself does not mock Christ. And the church, I think, by holding high the name of Jesus, by proclaiming the gospel, by worshiping God in a God-honoring way, by being the church, is a witness against the darkness around us. The light, simply by being light, stands in opposition to the darkness. And I don't know how it plays out in Australia, but certainly in the United States, I think there are Christians who find that sort of church-based approach to be somewhat low energy. They want to transform the culture by a week on Wednesday. And if my analysis of how we got here is broadly correct, what we're up against is a culture that has been centuries in the making. It's not going to be turned around by a week on Wednesday. It's probably not going to be turned around in the lifetime of my granddaughter. If it's going to be turned around, it's going to be turned around as the Roman Empire was turned around over several hundred years through Christians being good, faithful Christians in their local churches and their local communities. And I think that's what we need to hold on to. We should be involved in politics. We should vote in accordance with our Christian-shaped consciences. But our primary thrust must be the faithfulness of the church, because if the church is faithful, she is a light to the Gentiles, just by virtue of that fidelity.
Yeah, and it's something that I've said to young people. If you could hear that in 5 generations' time, if each of your generations was faithful to the gospel, that God would bring revival in 5 generations' time, would you be willing to be that first generation? And that's confronting too, because that shows too that even as Christians, we've bought into the immediacy of the cultural moment.
Yeah,
right? That's part of our.
Can I just pull you back to one thing you just said in that previous answer, which just something clicked for me. So part of what we're talking about is just how the church instinctively responds to these things. I think what I'm hearing you saying is, if I'm truly convinced and helpfully reminded, and I'm picking my words deliberately now, that the Lord Jesus Christ is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, then when I see him mocked in that way, I will more instinctively be, what's the word you used? Vexed by it. And so the idea that I might actually in one sense, want to work with it is less appealing to me. Is that what you're arguing, or is something slightly different?
I think a grasp of the transcendence of God puts the world and me in context. I think a grasp of the transcendence of God enables me to understand, in some ways, the darkness and the power of sin more dramatically. And so, I would say when you look at something like the Paris Olympics, yes, Christians should be shocked, but they should not be surprised. They shouldn't be caught off guard. This is the kind of stuff we expect. It's offensive, yes, and we can certainly, as citizens of the free world, express displeasure and our upset at this. But we need to remember that God is sovereign and in control. And we also need to remember that our primary duty is to the people we're next to in a church on Sunday, the people in whose community our church is a witness. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to get at, sort of keeping the response in proportion.
And look, we'll get to church because I think we're going to come on to this issue of Protestant and Roman Catholic Orthodoxy issue. And the transcendence issue buys into that a little bit because we do live in the imminent frame, as the term is. And you're seeing, and there was a recent Christianity Today article, which I think we've all read, on Protestant conversions to Rome or Orthodoxy. And some of it seems to be around public square ethics, that they lean into it better. Also about transcendence as well, that the experience feels more transcendent than the horizontal experience of church that we've
they just
been
got
pitching.
better buildings, don't they?
Yeah, they've got better buildings and they dress better, but maybe not better than
maybe
us.
Too much. Maybe no, I think as an Anglican we kind of hit just that sweet spot.
Yeah, but there's something going on there, isn't there? That you see, and I have personally experienced that with a member of our congregations doing that, and it's painful because. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's very real. So here in New South Wales, we had a debate in Parliament about legalising abortion, decriminalising it a number of years ago, I think just slightly pre-COVID. And I went, for the first time in my life, I went to a public rally.
I was at that rally just by accident because I was in New South Wales.
I remember you saying you... Yeah. Anyway, so I'm there, and did you notice this? At the first rally,
Who was there?
Just couldn't find the Protestants.
No.
It was all the Roman Catholics and all this
Orthodox
swathe of Middle Eastern Catholic kind of... They were all there. Loud and hard, and the Protestants, so much so that we actually did an event at Parramatta Cathedral just to raise some interest amongst it. So in all these ways, in one sense, you go, are they winning? Are Protestants losing? So Carl, what's your take on that? Sort of, why is that happening, and how does that feed into some of these things about this quest for a deeper, more a truth with pedigree, you might say?
Right. Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, I think overall, the statistics of Protestants converting to Catholicism versus Catholics converting to Protestantism, I think Protestantism's winning. By
South America, especially.
Yes. Where it's losing, I think, is among, and this, I don't mean this to be condescending to other Christians at all. Where Catholicism's winning is among what I would describe as the intelligentsia of Protestantism. It's the real intellectual types who are looking for good arguments to respond to many of the social challenges that you've outlined. And I think Catholicism has just thought much more thoroughly about those issues and has a deeper tradition on them. Or people who are waking up to the fact that, I see this at Grove City College where I teach. We have students coming from good, what I would describe as big box evangelical churches, where the ministers preach faithfully and they've been loved and cared for and nurtured. I don't mean this as a criticism of those churches at all, but where they've never been taught there is such a thing as church history. They've never been taught there is liturgy. They've never understood that worship can sometimes not simply be true, but can also be beautiful in certain circumstances. And what I've noticed at Grove is that by and large, many of us students from those backgrounds go to the Anglican Church. Some carry on the journey and go to Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And I would say when I chat to those students, I have a lot of sympathy with the criticisms they're making of their background. I always impress on them, be grateful for your background, for the people who loved you, cared for you, and discipled you. But I have sympathy for those who say, but We were never taught that the faith has a history. We were never taught that the language we use of Trinity and incarnation, etc., has a history, and it excites them. We were never taught that you could actually have an approach to sexual morality that isn't simply pulling proof texts from the Bible, but is rooted in the idea of human beings as embodied creatures made in the image of God. Protestantism, I think, has the resources to address these issues. It's just that
we haven't leaned
people
into
of
them
my generation and earlier, we never did that.
Yeah.
I often think that the reason why my generation never did that was that the broader Western culture carried the weight. By and large, everybody thought homosexuality was wrong. Pretty much everybody thought abortion was wrong, or at best, very a bad choice in a bad and mixed up world. We were not prepared for the culture doing a 180 on these issues and suddenly leaving us having to think about things we'd never thought about before because the cultural tide was simply flowing our way.
But just to be a bit touchy-feely about it, it just seems to me, the Romans and the Orientals, they're just braver about it as well.
I agree.
Why? Why is that? Because it's not like they're living in a different world to the one that we're living in. Or are they in their mind?
Well, I think some of it comes from the fact that by and large, Catholics have been, and again, let's be clear, we're not talking about all Catholics here. Most Catholics I know are like most Protestants I know. They go to church maybe at Christmas. They get the baby baptized and they hope to be buried and married. Well, married and then buried. We don't want to get that. I don't want to do that the wrong way around.
I don't know what you Presbyterians are doing. That's right.
So we're not talking about all Catholics. We're talking about a significant number, I think, of the church leadership, and then the very committed Catholics. And I would say that they do have one thing that certainly Protestants in the US don't have, and that is a long history of being outsiders. I can't comment on Australia, but certainly the establishment in the United States until, think about George W. Bush, really the last white Anglo-Saxon Protestant president. Anglo-Saxon Protestants were the establishment up until very, very recently. And Catholics were not. Committed Catholics were outsiders. And if you're an outsider, first of all, you tend to make strong communities. And secondly, I think you will often tend to be courageous because you have to take a stand. If you're a Jew in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, you're likely going to be courageous because you don't have a lot of choice. Protestants, we've had it easy. And I think that was a blessing in many ways, but has also made us very unprepared for the challenges that have suddenly emerged onto the scene in the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have a French evangelical friend who teaches in an American literature at a French university. And apart from the, who cares if the culture doesn't love he's very robust because you're in France, you're never going to be a majority.
No.
But his church of 65 in their village in the north of France, it's like, this is what it is. We're not expecting to get the culture back because we didn't have it in the first place.
And almost a sense once you've understood that, you can get on with the time.
And he's very liberated to that.
Yeah. So what needs then to click in Western Protestants then, Carl, and what do we need to be doing now?
Well, again, I'm really speaking to an American audience here, but I think what needs to click in the American Protestant evangelical mind is you never really owned the culture, therefore it hasn't been stolen from you. Therefore, you shouldn't be as angry as you are. You should be just getting on with the job in hand. I think coming to America from being an English evangelical, and an English evangelical of a nonconformist, not an Anglican variety, but a nonconformist variety.
Okay. Yeah. No one told me this.
I was always, in the minority at college. I was the KICU at Cambridge was dominated by evangelical Anglicans.
Of course.
The Baptists and the Presbyterians, well, I was part of the catering corps. We didn't make any significant decisions. I just flipped the burgers at the house party.
He says it's like it's not a good thing.
I get it, Carl. I mean, my parents were married by Ian Paisley and were a part of his church for 6. So I'm ready to fight now, right? But we're over and against everything.
You should see our regular episodes, Carl. We're just well behaved because you're here. Yeah,
that is.
There's plastic on the floor.
A podcast in itself.
There's plastic on the floor.
There's therapy.
It's actually spelled Jewel, Guel.
Well, look. Can we get to you're teaching at a Christian college in America, and obviously here in Australia, because we feel minority in Australia because it's never like it's been Australia's never been a fully Christian culture in that sense.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. What's the state of Christian colleges in the US? And it seems to be a huge movement compared to Australia, especially at tertiary level. Yeah. Are they going through the same seismic changes? And what are students like? What are the faculty dealing with? And all those sorts of things. Because we look at Christian colleges from a distance and go, wish we had more of those.
Right.
But we don't probably understand them as much as we could.
I think it varies. It's not a one size fits or explains all. I think a lot of Christian colleges that have moved leftward over the years are now struggling with recruitment. We're in an era where niche distinctiveness, I think, is easy, for want of a better term, is easier to market than generic blandness. Secondly, Americans have something of an advantage, certainly over the United Kingdom. Again, I can't speak to Australia, but the Constitution and the Bill of Rights allow for certain, I wouldn't say privileging of religion because that's not what they're meant to do, but the separation of church and state means that the way things work out legally in America relative to religion is different. And colleges are able to take advantage of that at times. Where it gets complicated, I think, is government money. And the government decided due to the Supreme Court case involved was Grove City College, my own college, is the Supreme Court precedent on this. The Supreme Court decided that if students take loans from the government to fund their education, then the institution is in receipt of government money. And what we call Title IX of the Civil Rights Act therefore applies. Now, Title IX in its origins was in many ways not a particularly, there's not much there that a Christian would object to. It's basically sex equality. Of course, it's now being used to press issues of sexuality and gender, those kind of things. Grove City College, where I work, as a result of our court case, does not take any government money.
Interesting.
And therefore, we enjoy more freedom than other colleges. There are only a handful of colleges like us in the United States, but we cannot be coerced in quite the same way by the government that other colleges are. And I think it will be Title IX where the issue comes to pinch.
So tell us how
colleges.
So how did that hit enrollments? I mean, this is a fascinating topic. When we spoke to Aaron Wren a while ago, we talked about this issue as well, and and we're thinking through this hard. It's a big topic.
It's a big issue here.
The schools are the presenting issue on the underlying issue of religious freedom that's being debated, and
so they make the front page of all the major papers on why should we be funding these people with their unreconstructed hatred. Well, they use the word.
Yeah, every time the legislation is going to get debated, but
it's just been shelved.
Yesterday, almost miraculously, there's another article about some poor kid who was told they couldn't turn up in whatever they wanted to do for the prom, went to a Christian school and was shocked that someone taught Christian theology. Yeah. So, how did it hit enrollments then when you guys went, well, we just can't take loan money?
Well, this was 30, it might be 50 years ago. So I can't remember the exact date.
It's a long
time
Saw that
ago.
coming. Yeah.
Yes. So it it was actually driven at the time, I think, by Grove City's libertarian impulses. It was not that the board disagreed with what Title IX of the Civil Rights Act was trying to do. It was that they didn't want the government telling them that's what they had to do. And we are now the beneficiaries religiously of an earlier generation of libertarianism, I think, at the college. I think at the moment what we're seeing in Grove is our recruitment is buoyant, and buoyant recruitment at the current time is increasing recruitment effectively, because a lot of colleges, particularly Christian colleges, are really struggling to recruit. And I think our stand relative to the government has proved to be a real asset among conservative Christian families who are looking for a school that isn't going to be coerced into whatever the latest politically correct position is. The real problem for other colleges that want to get to where we are is that it's not so much recruitment, but to get from taking government money to not taking government money.
It costs a lot of money
it's
itself.
An almighty budget shift. It's hard to imagine how that can be achieved without significant pain.
But there is hope there, isn't there? So again, I think what you're expressing is as parents feel that the culture gets more hostile to them, they actually want these alternative communities,
something that's different.
They're almost a ring fence that actually are able to be who they want to be, and they're prepared to actually get their wallets out and pay for it.
Of course, that's where the soft pressure can be brought to bear.
Oh, of course.
If word is put out that your college creates haters, they're not going to be recruited by the med schools.
And that is the problem. It's accreditation from the peak bodies and the professional bodies that could be your problem.
Accreditation is another issue. Now, again, in America, I think what would happen if an accredited tried to pull accreditation on these issues is that would lead to a long and expensive legal case that would go all the way to the Supreme Court and would take years and years to decide. So America does have these checks and balances that are helpful, I think, to religious conservatives at this point.
Yeah. Carl, we've just got a few more minutes with you. I'm going to do a question without notice, but it's the kind of thing that I'm always fascinated by. When America sneezes, or I want to say when Trump farts, the rest of the world is affected one way or another. It's just been a really interesting few months there in the States. We don't want to do a who should you vote for thing, but what do you make of what's just been going on the last few weeks with the way the shooting, the way it's responded to, the Biden thing, the now the Harris? Again, how do we understand what's going on there? Irrespective of whether we're going to go one way or another, just help us get a framework of understanding what's going on.
I think on one level, one could say that both parties have become not even say the monopolies, but both parties are basically enthralled to their most radical wings. Radical wings that I think don't represent an awful lot of the American people, but in a bipartisan system with a presidential election, it pushes most people to vote for one candidate or the other. I think the other thing that's become clear is that the media, by and large, are heavily loaded in favor of the Democrats.
You don't say.
I've not noticed.
I'm shocked.
Very obvious. Yeah, I mean, I know that's a great surprise. Thirdly, I think the sheer... If I were to compare the two parties, not in terms of policy, but in terms of discipline, the Democratic Party is a ruthlessly disciplined machine on the whole. Trump seems a remarkably, and this is not a comment on his policies and not a statement of who I will or will not vote for in November. But I would say if anybody can lose this election for the Republicans, which should be a shoo-in for them, with the economy, with all that's gone on at the border, with the chaos that's descending in other parts of the world that has effectively been encouraged by displays of American weakness. If anybody should be a shoo-in at this election cycle, it should be a Republican candidate. It doesn't look as if it's going that way at the moment. That to me is absolutely stunning. And the Wall Street Journal, which I read every day, the reporting is often fairly liberal and the opinions are pretty conservative.
Interesting. Yeah.
And today's Wall Street Journal contained, I think, 3 opinion pieces essentially saying that there is a total lack of discipline in the Republican Party.
Yes, I read the Wall Street Journal for the same reason to see. Well, I get the New York Times and that for my sins to keep unbalanced on both sides. But I noticed those articles yesterday too that Trump is supposed to be the one who will win it, but he's also the one who's going to lose it for them as well.
And that picture of Trump after he was shot, I texted that to my mum straight away in Britain. I said, "This is the picture. Forget the arguments. This is the picture that wins the election."
So that's what I said.
And then it all switched out.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Biden stepped down. And,
oh, man.
And
he kept his mouth shut for a week. He just managed to keep his mouth shut for a week.
Yeah. And it became patently obvious that the Trump campaign seemed to have no post-Biden strategy.
Yeah, that's right.
They should have gone into this campaign thinking there's at least a 50-50 chance we won't be facing this guy in November. We need an alternative strategy.
I know. It was like they were praying that the Lord Almighty wouldn't take Biden out.
Well, I was going to do one little follow-up on that because, we're all fascinated by the politics, but what ought pastors to be doing now?
That's a good
getting
question.
ready for that? Because again, I think I mentioned to you earlier, before we recorded, I studied in America in 1993 to 1994, became a Christian there, very, very grateful for it. But even then, what struck me as a young 19-year-old was just how polarized the nation was, even back then. So I don't know what it's like being a pastor with all the expectations, especially if you're kind of in a more conservative place and a more conservative theology, with all the expectations about what you ought to be talking to. What's your advice to pastors in robust, let's call it robust political climates like that?
I think it's a very difficult time to be a pastor in America from that perspective. I think what you need to do is, and it's something, pastors always need to be playing the long game. And I think if you're a pastor who has established a certain culture within their church, it's easier to handle some challenges when they come up. And I think of the time I spent as a pastor. I was a pastor under both President Obama and President Trump. And whenever I led worship, I always prayed for the president. I always gave thanks that I lived in a democratic republic. I always gave thanks that the Lord had placed civil magistrates in positions of authority. I always gave thanks for the president. I prayed that the Lord would make him wise. And then I would always pray at the end, and I said, and if he doesn't know you, Jesus is his personal savior, I pray too that you'll be gracious to him and bring him to a saving knowledge of you. I did that for President Obama every time. I did the same for President Trump every time. Now, I think when you do that kind of thing, you create a culture where the real partisans are going to go anyway. They're going to leave, and that's going to be a kind of blessed reduction. And hopefully those who are left behind, whichever side of the divide they land on, realize that the pastor's a good man trying to do a difficult job in difficult circumstances. So I would say it's probably too late to create that culture now if you haven't done it before. But I think, for guys out there listening to this who are thinking of going into the ministry, think about that. The problem with the way politics is going these days is politics is no longer about rates of income tax or mixed economy versus free market versus state command economies. Politics has spread into anthropology.
Yes, exactly.
It's a
vision of human flourishing.
Yeah,
what is that?
Almost like you describe in your book, Carl.
Yeah. Somebody should write a book on it.
Someone should do.
The problem with that is the pastors have to speak on that stuff.
Yes, that's so
And they
true.
have to take a stand. And that translates into partisan politics in many people's minds. And I think that's just the place we find ourselves in. We have to do it. One thing I would never do, and I was on Tom Askell's podcast last year. I love Tom, and he was really pressing me on this to make a partisan comment. And I said, I just won't make a partisan comment. But I will say the following issues are important, and I trust that Christian people will know that, and that will shape which box they tick when they go into the voting booth. I do think pastors, where at all possible, have to avoid making partisan statements from the pulpit. Yeah. Maybe it won't be possible at some points, but I do think that it's a lot more possible than a lot of Americans think it is.
Let the congregation decide where those issues land on the different things.
Yeah.
And none of this vote Pedro stuff going on anymore. Yeah.
I mean, I would say the hashtag never Trumpers over here. I can't say I would never vote for Trump. No. I can't. I can imagine a possible world where I might find it necessary to vote for him. And who makes you think you're so important that you should be telling me how to vote anyway? That's the difficulty.
That's the culture, right? That's right. The culture does, because your authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Well, Carl, post-November, I'd be interested to know what your next book would be. You've written about the... what's your next book?
It is.
Give us a scoop. Give us a scoop, Carl.
I've got one coming out in October on critical theory.
Oh, good.
Outstanding.
To change all worlds, critical theory from Marx to Marcuse.
Oh, that's
so I'm not dealing with the critical race stuff, but I'm dealing with the foundations. And then a year hence, I'm just wrapping up the manuscript in the next few days. I have a book on desecration as central to what's going on in our current climate. And one of the points I'm going to make in that book is desecration is not a monopoly of left or right politically. We can all be guilty of desecration wherever we fall on the political spectrum. So
that's going to be fun.
If you guys want to have me on back on so I can promote my stuff, I'll be very happy to.
Fantastic. I was going to say, well, we got to get you back on. That'll be excellent. I think we kind of just wrap. I could do this for hours, right?
Yeah, you could, but we should wrap it up.
We should wrap it up. Carl, thank you so much for giving us your time. We know you're really, really busy, not least writing books and the rest of it. We really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us here on Dual Citizens.
Always happy to hang out with Australians. I never feel more classy than when I'm in the presence of Australians.
And we dressed up too.
We are. We tried really, really hard today.
And we still don't have the accent.
That's right. Okay.
Thanks so much, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks.
Well, you've been listening to Dual Citizens with Stephen McAlpine
and David Auld.
I am Carl Trueman, and I watch Dual Citizens, and so should you, because it's the nearest thing you'll get to culture in Australia.